Hungarian folk tales. Tiny Tom and the Lily Princess. Once upon a time, far, far away, over the ocean and beyond, there lived a king, and with the king lived a queen. And they had a very tiny son. No matter how many doctors they took him to, he just wouldn't grow. Tiny he was, and tiny he remained. The king grieved much over this, the queen even more. So much so that she fell ill. On her deathbed she lay and called for the king. She said to him, "All I ask of you is that when you bury me, have a lily planted on my grave and have it guarded day and night so that no one can steal it." She spoke, and straight away she died. The king was much in grief. "If only my son were big, who can I leave my kingdom to when I am dead?" He buried his queen in pomp, wept over her, and mourned her. And he sent a proclamation across the kingdom calling for everyone who had a lily to bring it to the court so that one could be chosen for the queen's grave. They brought lilies by the cartload, but they couldn't agree which one was the finest of all. The king could hear all this uproar and went down into the courtyard. "What's all this quarrelling about?" One of the gardeners replied. "There are so many lilies here that we can hardly move, but we can't decide which one is the finest of all." "Where are you, Tiny Tom, my son? Come here and do something useful for a change. Close your eyes and pick a lily." So Tiny Tom closed his eyes and groped around like a blind man. And do you know what? The lily he picked was beautiful, and every bloom on it sparkled like a diamond. The king asked, "Who brought us this lily?" "Your Majesty, I brought it from Fairy Helen's garden." "Well then, you plant it and keep guard over it so that no one can steal it." "If you please, Your Majesty, may I ask that you send Tiny Tom with me? So if I should doze off, he'll be awake and alert." "Very well then," said the king. And so it happened. The old woman planted the flower and guarded it as if it were her life itself. So there they were, keeping guard until the old woman said, "Tiny Tom, I'm going to lie down for a while and I'll drop off to sleep. You stay guard over the lily so that no one can take it." "No one can take it? You sleep well, old lady." And while Tiny Tom was keeping guard, out of nowhere appeared a little man. "Good evening, Tom. Do you know what kind of flower you're guarding here?" "Well, I know that it's a lily and it comes from Fairy Helen's garden." "You see, that lily is the princess from Dwarfland. Let me tell you. Helen once went to see the king in Dwarfland and took a great liking to the princess. So she begged the king to let her have his daughter for a week or two, and he did. Helen was envious of her beauty, and she treated the princess so badly that she wept and wept, and then she died. When she was buried, that lily grew out of her grave, and it spoke once. "Take me to the grave where a mother cried as much as I did over her dwarf of a son." And when the old nurse heard this, she pulled up the lily and brought it here. But Fairy Helen's own nurse heard all of this and told Fairy Helen. Now Helen can never be at peace until the flower is stolen back from here. "Come here and I'll see to your troubles." And at that, the little dwarf of a man pulled his beard from between his legs and he disappeared as if he had never been there. Tom was thinking and tried to stay awake. Suddenly, he heard a fluttering and rustling. 12 fairies appeared. They made a circle around Tom, dancing, thinking that they could make him dizzy and one of them could steal the lily from the grave. But Tom was sharp. He shook the old woman awake and said, "Get up, old lady, they've come for the lily." So the old woman jumped up and took out her old spindle, and then, swish, swish, she went at them. "Be off with you from here," she said, and she beat and slapped the fairies until they flew off back to fairyland without the lily. There they told Fairy Helen that they had failed to bring the lily with them. Now she had a 7-legged horse, and she mounted it, and off she went. Now as Tiny Tom was keeping guard, he suddenly heard a voice. "Tom, I think they're going to take me away. Fairy Helen is coming." And out of the lily there came a tiny young woman, more beautiful and radiant than the golden sun itself. Tom, if only I had my butterfly carriage for us to fly away in." And at the very moment she said that, 6 butterflies came flying there, drawing a fine carriage. The dwarf princess asked, "Will you come with me, Tom?" "Of course I will. Never will I part from you." Up they went, up and up, into the bright blue sky. The princess turned and said, "Tom, look back and tell me what you see." "Oh, it's Fairy Helen. Don't let her catch up with us." Up and up they flew as fast could be. Suddenly a huge sheet of flame came licking at Tom's back. "Tom, look back and tell me what you see now." "Oh, it's Fairy Helen. Her horse's breath is aflame and I can feel its heat. Just let us get up between the sun and the stars and the moon, for up there she has no powers." Now when they reached Dwarfland, the joy was great indeed. So pleased was the king to see his long-lost daughter that he swept her into his arms and covered her in kisses. He did the same with Tom. He said straight away that he would give his daughter's hand to Tom and make him king of the land. Then came the great wedding feast. There was no end to the dwarfs there, each one more handsome than the next, and everybody lived happily ever after. Hungarian folk tales. Wooden Peter. Once there lived a farmer and his wife. Now these good people didn't have any children, and so one day the farmer said to his wife, "I'm going off into the forest to carve us a child out of wood." Now his wife laughed at this, but the farmer bundled up his stuff and set off into the forest. There he met some wood carvers. "God blessings on you this day. I came to get a small piece of wood." So they chopped him a piece of wood and he started to carve himself a child. It was evening when he returned home, and his wife laughed when she saw he'd brought home a wooden child. They had their supper, and there was a little left over. "Now that's just enough for our son." Off they went to bed, and around midnight the boy called out, "Well, mother dear, are you sound asleep?" At that moment they woke up, and great was their surprise to see the wooden boy had come to life. They admired the boy until the break of day, and then the priest baptized him and named him Wooden Peter. When he came to be 3 days old, he asked if he could go out and find himself a friend to play with. "Hey, do you know if there's someone who makes swords in this town?" "Of course there is." So the boy went back into the house. "Father, please could you give me 8 florins? You can have whatever you need. All I need is 8 florins. And off he went to the sword maker. Good day to you, good sword maker. Let me have for 8 florins the sword that you first made. That's the one for me. So the sword maker went to the swords and sorted until he found an old rusty sword and a sheath to go with it. Peter took the sword, strapped it on, and it looked like the sword had been made especially for him. Now, here's your 8 florins, for even your first sword has to be paid for. Next day there was a huge mob of people in the town. As they were moving towards the fair, they heard that there were 2 oxen tethered together with a golden chain. Whoever could cut the chain in 2 could take the oxen as his own. So Wooden Peter stepped up to say, "If you'll permit me, I'll cut the chain." So then Peter set to, and he cut that golden chain with a swish and a swoosh that could be heard across the country, far and near. Up went the tails of the 2 oxen, and they didn't stop trotting until they reached the stable. The owner of the oxen said, "Well, Wooden Peter, off with you home to feed the oxen, but you should know that all they eat is glowing embers." Peter set fire to 12 bundles of wood. When they were aflame, he took the water pail and filled it with glowing embers. The 2 oxen ate them all up, and one of them went off to where the sun rises, one to where the sun sets. So Peter said, "Now, Father, let me show you something." He tapped the corner of the gate with his fingers in 2 places, and from one of them good wine gushed out, and from the other good brandy. "Now, Father, everyone can drink to their heart's content. Do you see that wheelbarrow?" "I do indeed, son." "And that millstone?" "Yes, I see it." "Now, when the barrow stands in front of the door and the millstone jumps into it of its own accord, the wine will turn to water and the brandy to deep red blood, and then you'll know that I am dead. And then, if you want to find me, sit into that wheelbarrow and I'll take you to where I am. Now, I have to go off to see the world and try my fortune." After that, Wooden Peter set off across 7 lands and 7 seas until he came to a town in which there lived a king. "Good day to you, your good majesty." "Welcome you are. And what sort of journey are you on?" "I set off to be of service, to try my fortune." "And how much would you require for a year?" "Nothing at all, only what I eat and what I drink." So Peter stayed in the town, working as a carpenter. He was so clever with his hands that the old king took a liking to him. Now the king had a daughter who fell so in love with Wooden Peter that she thought she would die if she wasn't allowed to marry him. "Well then," said the king, "I won't have you dying on me, so I'll let you give him your hand and be his wife. I'll announce a great wedding feast, and you'll live as husband and wife." One day the king received a letter telling him to gather together everyone in the land to go off to fight in the war. When the king saw this, he began to weep. "Now, good Father Majesty, do not weep, for I'll go alone to the war." "My son, what can you do alone? You'll be like a gnat against a bison." But Wooden Peter went off, and he was wielding his sword so fiercely that he beat them one and all. But then he stumbled, and that's how they defeated him. As quickly as they could, they buried him in the ground. In the morning, as the light was dawning, the barrow went to the door. The millstone jumped into it of its own accord, the wine turned to water, and the brandy to deep red blood. So the farmer got into the barrow and went to where Peter had been cut down. He searched for him high and low, but to no avail. Then he saw the 2 oxen coming. The two oxen began to turn the soil with their horns until they uncovered Peter, but there was no sign of life in him. And so one ox put him back together again, and the other put his soul back into him. And Wooden Peter awoke. I slept so well. You'd have slept forever if it hadn't been for us, said the oxen. They went home, and the king called the whole court together and crowned Wooden Peter king. And he and his queen lived happily ever after. Hungarian folk tales. How I passed my childhood. Now, when I was born and all of 6 weeks old, out I went into the street on a hot summer's day, and I met a true old friend of mine who was a bottle ahead of me and tipsy with it. So we made a pair of oxen out of mud, a cart and sacks to load onto the cart to take them off to the mill and grind them. And off we went. Now, in those days there was a water mill to do the milling, but it wasn't there. The miller was strolling up and down on the water, and so we asked him to call up the mill, and he waved for it and shouted until up it came and we could start to mill away. Now, the miller man didn't have a scoop, so he pulled off my head and used that as a scoop. So when we were finished and off I went on my way home, who did I meet but a shower of women and young ones who started to laugh at me. "What are you laughing at?" says I. "Ah, you don't have a head," says they. And that's how I knew I'd left my head behind in the mill. Back I went, put the head onto my neck, and off for home again. But the women and the young ones were laughing at me again. "Now, what are you laughing at?" says I. "Isn't your nose at the back of your head?" says they. So I gave my head a good twist to set it right and off for home again. Now that's when I remembered that I'd stuck my whip into the ground behind the mill pond. Back I went, but when I got there, what did I see but that a great big tree had shot up from it and my old whip was up at the top. So up and up I climbed, and there at the top, what did I find but a hawk chasing a whole cloud of little birds, trying to catch them any way at all. Straight away the little birds, one and all, flew right up my sleeves, into my shirt, and right up my legs, into my breeches. Quick as a flash I tied up my sleeves and breeches, and wasn't I happy that I'd caught so many birds. Yes, indeed. And all these birds in my shirt and breeches started off chirping and tweeting, and all of them giving off in their own language, until up they flew with me and carried me off far, far away. I saw the women washing and scrubbing down on the edge of the sea. They looked up and shouted out, "Look at that big bird!" But I thought I heard them say, "Loosen your shirt!" So that's what I did, and out flew the birds, and down I plopped into the sea. I made such a big splash that I emptied out all the water, and the fishes were all left around me. So I gathered up a fine lot of them. I didn't waste any more time there because I was far from home. So I set off back through Hotland. Now, Hotland is a strange country indeed, where they don't build their houses on the ground, but up in the air at the height of a man. So they need ladders to get in. The people in Hotland are all big and tall, and everything is big. Even the church was so big that there were 4 soldiers in there on a horseback, and when the priest chanted, "The Lord be with you," one of the soldiers spurred his horse and off he went, and he intoned it to the second soldier to the third to the fourth, and he sang it to the respondent. So long was the Mass that the congregation could have done with a good breakfast. But that was no problem at all, since the altar was made of ham and the candles were sausages. And just as big and tall was the steeple of the church. When 2 carpenters were building it, they dropped their hatchets, and by the time one of them fell to the earth, it had rotted away. And when the second was in the air, a lark nested in it, and before it reached the ground, it had laid its eggs and raised its chicks. The bell was so large, the only way they could get it into the belfry was to carry it up when it was a baby and let it grow up there. It was hotter than hot there, so hot that all they did was slaughter a pig, put it in a pan and put the pan out of the window, and straight away they had roast pork. But I didn't waste too much time there either. I'd had enough and continued on my way home. That's how I got to Coldland. It was so cold there that the white of an egg would freeze so brightly that you could read a newspaper by its light. You couldn't speak there unless you could read, because when a man said a word, it straight away froze in front of him and the other had to read it. But I didn't waste too much time in Coldland. On I went, on my way home. By the end, I was getting so fed up with the journey that I stuck my whip into the earth and climbed up to the heavens. And there was my grandmother. "The best of the day to you, Grandma. Do you have some bread and jam for me?" "Oh, dear son," says she, "up here we don't really eat." "You don't? Then how do I get down from here quickly?" Then an old man arrived and I told him as well that I wanted to get back down because there was no bread and jam to be had here at all. The old man remembered that they had a chest of bran and we twisted a rope out of that. I could lower myself down. And as true as I'm here, we plaited it fine enough, but a mouse somehow got into it, and when I was lowering myself back down, that little mouse bit right through the rope, and I plopped down into the ground. I thought I was in the old town somewhere near the church, but I wasn't. I was at the edge of the new town, and I was well and truly drilled into the earth, so I shouted out for them to dig me out, but no one came. So I had to go home for a spade and dig myself out. And that's all I remember of my own younger days and how I passed them.